Good evening and welcome to the Green Island Radio Show. I'm your host, Harry O'Donoghue. Our producer is Cindy Hill, and The Green Island is a production of Georgia Public Broadcasting, recorded right here in Savannah, Georgia. Nice to be with you again this evening, and that intro piece was performed by the Chieftains. A little different intro for you tonight because we have a different show. That was called Fernie Hill, from the album The Long Black Veil. And we're very pleased to have two gentlemen with us on tonight's show here in the studio. We have the esteemed Dr Howard Keeley from Georgia Southern University. Over the years, I've done a lot of work for the Centre for Irish Studies. And Howard, I believe you changed the name.
Our new name is the Centre for Irish Research and Teaching, which is a bit of a mouthful, but we're just calling it CIRT, C-I-R-T.
And seated right beside Howard is author, historian, and TV personality James Alexander Bunbury, also known as Turtle. Good evening to you, sir.
Good evening, Harry. It is a pleasure to be here. It is wonderful to be here in beautiful Savannah. I've long heard about it, and it does not disappoint.
Now, Turtle, the most popular series of books you've done apparently is Vanishing Ireland. Can you tell us a little bit about that project?
It was with a friend of mine, James Fennell, who's a brilliant photographer. And the pair of us decided to head around Ireland interviewing and photographing people of an older generation in their 80s, 90s, 100s. The oldest was 108, wonderful Stacia Keeley. And people whose stories they're not generally recorded or registered at all. And we would go and find blacksmiths and farmers and people from fishing communities and seamstresses and so on. And we ended up interviewing, I think, about 250 people across Ireland over the course of what became 4 books. And going down back roads all across the country, it was a really good excuse to explore beautiful Ireland and end up in places that you'd never, ever end up when you went off to try and find somebody's farmhouse or something. And to listen to the wisdom of these incredible people. From my perspective as a historian, I was interested in their life story, where they were born and what it was like growing up, sometimes against the backdrop of the troubles of the 1919, the revolutionary period. But I also would like I got them to go back in time and tell me about their parents and their grandparents. And for instance, it was astonishing to me, how many of them, their grandparents were children, if not teenagers, at the time of the famine, or the Great Hunger, as I'm increasingly inclined to call it. And when you get out to places like Connemara and you see, how barren the landscape is, I mean, it's absolutely gorgeous to visit as a tourist, and you can go to a hotel if you want food, but there wasn't any hotels knocking around in Black 47. It would have been an incredibly hard existence, which, explains why quite so many people, did what they could to get out of Dodge, as they say.
Yes, and of course, Black 47, for those of you who don't know, it was the worst year of the famine, and so it was called Black 1847, which prompts me to ask about your new book about 1847.
1847, with a subtitle, A Chronicle of Genius, Generosity and Savagery. It was
great subtitle.
Well, it was trying to put the famine in context of all the events that were going on around the world at that time. So, a significant chunk of it does focus on Ireland and what was going on in Ireland and all the horror there. But I also wanted to I didn't want it to be a completely downbeat book. So there's a lot of stories about the incredible generosity that went on during that time. And there were the most remarkable people who came to the aid or did what they could to help. There was a fisherman called Rodney Baxter who set sail from Cape Cod with a bunch of buddies in their sort of schooners and came across the Atlantic and into Sligo town and started unloading food there and so on. Another guy got a massive US warship and brought that into Cork, stuffed with food. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire sent a massive check over to try and help restore the situation. And the other, which maybe you touched on lately with Leo Varadkar visiting, that he went to thank the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma for their generosity. So I was looking at those stories as well. But in America, the San Patricios were fighting in the Mexican-American War that was raging at that time. There were people trying to find the Northwest Passage up in with Sir John Franklin. So there's stuff going on everywhere, Vietnam and Australia, and it all kind of tied in together quite neatly, and there was a little Irish theme running through quite a lot of those stories. I'm always working on projects and filing away the stories and updating them as things go on. And then, so for the 1847 book, I've been working on that really since 2001, when I happened to go to Mexico and saw a plaque to the San Patricios, this battalion of Irish soldiers who were mostly executed for their role in the war that was on at that time. It was also Stephen Collins Foster, and he O Susanna had its debut in Cincinnati. I believe it might be controversial because I think a couple of places claim it, but in Cincinnati in 1847. So I wrote a story about him for the book as well. I wanted to touch a little bit on the music, because it was the year of Mendelssohn actually he's rather tragically died in 1847, but he was at the peak of his career, and yet you're also moving into Stephen Collins Foster, and that sort of era is coming on, and also the Mormon Tabernacle Choir kickstarts in 1847, so lots going on that front too.
There we had the Chieftains once again. Very appropriate music for this particular show. We heard the Kerry Slides, before that the Robbers Glen, and at the top the first three were Kerry polkas, 3 Kerry polkas, all from the Chieftains. And you are listening to the Green Island Radio Show here on Georgia Public Broadcasting. And we are in studio here this evening with Turtle Bunbury and Dr Howard Keeley. Very refreshing and interesting conversation. And Turtle, there's another book that's very, very popular you wrote about the First World War. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, that was a book called The Glorious Madness, and it was tales of the Irish in the First World War, in the Great War, which I started writing in 2013, where luckily there is now quite a lot of scholarship about the Irish who served, but it was still relatively unexplored at that time, because many of the Irish who had served in the British forces, in the Army or the Navy, or sometimes in the Air Force, found it very hard to come back to Ireland. They arrived back to Ireland after the war, where a revolution was in motion, where people who had served in the British forces were not particularly welcome, and it was a very complicated time, and so a lot of people just kept completely quiet about the fact that they had served, as well as the fact that they'd already gone through something like the Somme or Gallipoli, or these horrific events that one would be inclined to be quiet about anyway. So there was a lot of sort of details were kept under the rug for generations, and people forgot about them. So I wanted to explore that, but I also focused in on a lot of people stories. I love people stories rather than about a battle or anything. And I looked at a number of the characters who, for instance, came to the fore during the War of Independence, and later on, who'd fought in the British Army and maybe learnt their trick, like Tom Barry, who ended up running a sort of a flying brigade of the guerrilla campaign during the War of Independence. And looking at some of those characters, and some pretty wacky people too, like Flora Sands from County Kerry, who joined the Serbian army and became a sergeant major in the Serbian army. So there's some fun characters along the way.
There's a Serbian army?
Well, yeah, and Ireland was up against them in the First World War. They met one another in the field of battle, because that's just the way the battle lines were drawn.
Turlough O'Carolan. And you are listening to the Green Island Radio Show here on GPB. Now, because this is a music show, Turtle, let's just talk a little bit about where you think music is being kept alive, or the state of music in Ireland today.
If it is music you want, go to Clare, they say, or Christy Moore sang. I always think it's amazing when you go to County Clare how many people play music and how clever they are about making sure that people play music. All the young children learn an instrument. And when you go to places that are, busy places for visitors, for tourists, like Doolin and so on, I was there on a Monday night in October during a storm, not a bank holiday Monday, not a public holiday, but just a normal Monday night. And my job for that particular day was to go to all 4 pubs in the town and to see what was going on. All 4 of them were jam-packed. with people listening to really beautiful Irish music of different types in those 4 pubs. And I thought, well, that's brilliant and clever, and it's very good for local business, obviously. But that is what Clare is doing. I think it's really very clever, and I think there are other pockets across Ireland where that spirit is there as well, and it's lovely. It makes for a very special night. Sometimes we will turn up in a village or a town looking for characters. We might spot a character, and we'd stop, and I'd say, "Hello, I'm looking for somebody who knows a bit about the history of the area and all that." And he might turn around and say, "Yeah, you're a little bit late for that. All the characters are gone now." And again, I don't think they are, actually. Because, the thing is, it is always changing. I mean, I guess, vanishing things are moving on. But, with modern technology and TV age, and it's much more of a stay-at-home culture, than it was for many of those guys who, for instance, would have gone out to the pub a lot more regularly than people do nowadays. So, those aspects are changing a lot. But the wit and the quick-witted wisdoms that you hear from people who quite often left school at 12 or maybe 14, but quite often 12, and yet they speak profound truths that no philosopher has yet come up with. Just while they're sitting there. One of my favourite books that I've ever worked on was called The Irish Pub, where myself and Mr. Fennell, the photographer from the Vanishing Ireland series, we were commissioned for the arduous task of having to go around all 32 counties in Ireland to find the best pubs in each county. But we were looking for old-style pubs. I mean, to the extent that if you walked in and there was a television, we kind of walked out again, unless it was a discreet television, perhaps. But we found, I think, 40 of the finest pubs that we could find. It was a lovely project. But it was also, there was a vanishing element to that, because pubs in rural Ireland are largely to do with drink driving laws, which have got a lot tougher in Ireland in recent years. They've slightly disappeared, but it is strong in the big towns and some of the villages. You'll still get extremely good pubs, and boy, yes, you can have a very magical evening if all the ingredients come good, with a little bit of a soundtrack to boot.
Well, there's 4 who share